Hello and welcome. Have you ever stood in an old, quiet museum, looked at a faded photograph, and wondered about the life behind the eyes staring back at you? Not just the dates and the facts, but the real story. The laughter, the heartbreaks, the small, forgotten moments that make up a human soul. Today we're going to do just that. We're stepping back in time, past the veil of myth and revolution, to meet a young woman whose story is often lost in the shadow of a colossal family tragedy. We all know the name Romanov. It conjures images of unimaginable opulence, of Fabergé eggs and glittering palaces, and of a final brutal act in a dusty basement that ended a 300-year-old dynasty. We know the story of Nicholas, the reluctant Tsar, Alexandra, the tragic Tsarina, Olga, the responsible one, Tatiana, the elegant one, Anastasia, the mystery, and Alexei, the fragile heir. But what about the third daughter, the one often described with gentle, simple words, sweet, kind, beautiful? What about Maria Nikolaevna? For over a century, Maria's story has been a quiet melody in a loud, dramatic opera. She wasn't the intellectual, nor the firecracker, nor the one surrounded by legends of escape. She was, in many ways, the heart of the family, a figure of quiet strength and profound kindness, a girl who dreamed not of a crown, but of a husband, a home, and a flock of children. Her story isn't one of political intrigue or dramatic defiance. It's a much more intimate tale, a story about the fragile beauty of a gentle spirit caught in the merciless gears of history. So today, let's push past the grand narrative. Let's find the real Maria, the girl nicknamed Mashka, whose life, though tragically short, offers a poignant and deeply human look into the final days of Imperial Russia. This is the story of the lost angel of the Romanovs. To truly understand Maria, we must first understand the world she was born into. Imagine Russia at the turn of the 20th century. It wasn't just a country, it was a continent, an empire stretching from the frozen tundra of Siberia to the warm shores of the Black Sea. It was a land of staggering contradictions. In the glittering cities of St. Petersburg and Moscow, aristocrats spoke French better than Russian. Attending lavish balls that lasted until dawn, their fortunes built on the labor of millions who lived in conditions not far removed from medieval serfdom. This was a deeply spiritual land, where the scent of incense and the sound of Orthodox chants filled the air in thousands of onion-domed churches. It was the Russia of Tolstoy and Dostoevsky, of Tchaikovsky and Rachmaninoff, a culture bursting with soul-searching depth and passionate melancholy. Yet it was also an autocracy, an empire ruled by one man, the Tsar, whose power was believed to be ordained by God himself. This man was Maria's father, Nicholas II. Nicholas was, by all accounts, a profoundly decent man. He was a devoted husband, a loving father, and a person of deep personal integrity. His diary is filled not with matters of state, but with tender observations about his wife, notes on his children's health, and remarks on the weather. Unfortunately, the qualities that make a good family man do not necessarily make a good autocrat in a time of crisis. He was indecisive, resistant to change, and utterly convinced that he had to pass down the absolute power he had inherited to his future son. And then there was his wife, the Empress Alexandra Feodorovna. Born Princess Alex of Hesse, a granddaughter of Britain's Queen Victoria, she was stunningly beautiful but painfully shy and awkward in public. She viewed the frivolous Russian court with suspicion and disdain, preferring the quiet, isolated world of her family. Her conversion to Russian Orthodoxy was not a matter of political convenience. It was a deeply felt, passionate embrace of the faith, which grew more mystical and intense as the years went by. Her German heritage made her an object of suspicion, and her reserved nature was often misinterpreted as arrogance. Together, Nicholas and Alexandra created an intensely loving, insular world for themselves and their children, a bubble of domestic bliss floating precariously over a volcano of social and political unrest. Their greatest desire and the greatest pressure on them from the nation was to produce a male heir. Their first child, Olga, was born in 1895, a daughter. 2 years later, in 1897, came Tatiana, another daughter. The nation sighed with polite disappointment, but within the palace, the girls were adored. Then, on a sunny summer day, June 26, 1899, at their glorious Peterhof estate, Alexandra gave birth for the third time. Nicholas rushed to his diary to record the event. "A happy day," he wrote. "The Lord has given us a third daughter, Maria. The delivery was excellent and quick. Mama Alex feels very well." In the evening, the whole family gathered, and a Te Deum was sung. Another daughter. For the empire, it was another delay in securing the dynasty. But for Nicholas and Alexandra, it was another beloved child. And this one, from the very beginning, was special. Little Maria was a picture of health. She was a bonny baby with a cherubic face, light brown hair, and the most astonishing eyes. They were huge, dark blue, and so expressive that they earned the nickname Maria's saucers. While her older sisters had been delicate infants, Maria was robust, strong, and blessed with a placid, sunny temperament. She was, as her father fondly called her, a true Russian beauty. The French tutor, Pierre Gilliard, would later describe her as the picture of health, tall for her age and a mass of rosy-hued flesh. She was the embodiment of vitality in a family that would soon be haunted by fragility. Life for Maria and her sisters was lived within the walls of the Alexander Palace at Tsarskoye Selo, a small town just outside St. Petersburg. From the outside, it was a world of unimaginable privilege, but inside life was surprisingly, almost ascetically simple. Alexandra, influenced by her British upbringing, insisted that the girls sleep on hard camp cots with no pillows. They took a cold bath every morning and a warm one every evening. Their rooms were bright and airy, decorated with personal photographs and religious icons. But they were far from the opulent chambers, one might imagine. They were expected to do needlework and knit items for charity bazaars. This was their mother's attempt to instill discipline and humility, to keep them from being spoiled by the sycophantic court culture she so despised. But this disciplined upbringing also deepened their isolation. The girls, known collectively by their first initials as OTMA, had few friends their own age. They were almost entirely cut off from the Russian aristocracy. Their world was small and self-contained, consisting of their parents, a handful of tutors and attendants, and the officers of the Imperial Guard who protected them. It was a gilded cage, and while it was a cage filled with immense love and security, it left them utterly unprepared for the harsh realities of the world outside its gates. This sheltered existence would become even more pronounced after 1904, the year that brought both the family's greatest joy and its darkest secret. Visual, show photos of the Alexander Palace inside and out. Highlight the contrast between the grand exterior and the simple, almost Spartan, nursery and bedrooms of the Grand Duchesses. Show pictures of the four sisters together, emphasizing their closeness. Host. In August 1904, the long-awaited heir Alexei was born. The entire empire celebrated. Cannons boomed, bells rang, and prayers of thanks were offered up. But the joy was tragically short-lived. A few weeks after his birth, the infant Tsarevich began to bleed from his navel, and the bleeding wouldn't stop. The doctors were helpless. It was then that the horrified parents received the devastating diagnosis. Their precious son, the future of the Romanov dynasty, had hemophilia. It's difficult for us to comprehend today, in an age of modern medicine, the terror that this disease inspired. Hemophilia, the royal disease passed down from Queen Victoria through her daughters, meant that Alexei's blood lacked the agent that causes clotting. Any small bump, bruise, or cut could trigger a life-threatening internal hemorrhage. The attacks caused excruciating pain, with joints swelling to the size of melons, leaving the little boy immobilized and screaming in agony for days or even weeks on end. This terrible secret became the central organizing principle of the Romanovs' lives. It explained everything: Alexandra's frantic search for a cure, her descent into obsessive mysticism, and her fateful reliance on the one man who seemed able to stop Alexei's bleeding, the Siberian peasant and faith healer, Grigory Rasputin. The family retreated even further into their private world, their lives now revolving around the rise and fall of Alexei's health. The constant fear of his death cast a permanent shadow over the sunlit halls of the Alexander Palace. And it was in this atmosphere of love, isolation, and ever-present anxiety that young Maria grew up. Her role, almost from the start, seemed to be that of a comforting presence. Her robust health and cheerful disposition were a welcome antidote to the tension that so often filled the palace. While her sisters had their own distinct personalities, Olga, the thoughtful and sometimes moody bookworm, Tatiana, the poised and dutiful governess, Maria was simply and universally good. She was given affectionate nicknames that captured her essence. Her father called her Mashka, a common and warm Russian diminutive. The servants and staff often referred to her as the good Mashka. Her sisters sometimes teased her with the name Fat Little Bow Wow because of her sturdy build and her unwavering loyalty. She was an uncomplicated child, full of affection and a desire to please. Margareta Egar, one of the family's early governesses, noted that Maria adored her father with an almost worshipful passion. She would often try to sneak into his study, and if she was refused entry, she would blow kisses to his portrait. When she was a toddler and fell ill with measles, she couldn't bear to be separated from him. The nurses had to be told to stop mentioning his name because every time she heard the word Papa, she would begin to cry for him. This loving nature extended to everyone around her. She was a peacemaker among the sisters, often the one to smooth over a quarrel. While Anastasia was the family clown, famous for her pranks and mimicry, Maria was her most appreciative audience, and frequently her partner in crime, though Maria's conscience usually got the better of her, and she would confess their mischief. They were known as the little pair, sharing a bedroom and a close bond. But where Anastasia was sharp and witty, Maria was soft and gentle. She was the anchor to Anastasia's kite. Her innate goodness wasn't just reserved for her family. There are countless small telling anecdotes about her kindness. The most famous, perhaps, is the one about the palace guard. During a formal event for children, a young Maria noticed that one of the guards on duty looked hungry and couldn't partake in the feast. Unprompted, she filled a plate with sandwiches and cakes, snuck over to his post, and offered it to him. It was a simple, instinctive act of compassion, a complete disregard for the rigid protocol that governed every moment of her life. She saw a person in need, and she acted. This empathy was a core part of her being. She had a remarkable memory for the names and families of the soldiers who guarded them, and would often ask after their wives and children. She was a born nurturer. Her dreams for the future were not of power or glamour. From a very young age, she declared that she wanted to marry a soldier and have a very large family. Her aunt, Grand Duchess Olga Alexandrovna, recalled Maria's passionate declaration, "I want to get married and live in the country and have 20 children." It's a wonderfully innocent and revealing statement. It speaks of a longing for a normal earthbound life, a life filled with love, domesticity, and the simple joys of motherhood, a life that was the absolute antithesis of her imperial destiny. Her education, like her sister's, was rigorous, but she was not a natural scholar. While Olga devoured books and Tatiana excelled at organization, Maria often found her lessons tedious. She would doodle in her notebooks, her mind wandering to the gardens outside or to the soldiers drilling on the parade ground. Her tutor, Pierre Gilliard, noted with some frustration that she had great abilities, but a pronounced indolence. He meant she was lazy, but perhaps it was simply that her interest lay elsewhere. She loved to draw and paint and had a good eye for it. But more than anything, she was interested in people. She was a listener, an observer of human emotion. This budding romanticism and her fascination with the common soldier led to a series of innocent childhood crushes. These weren't scandalous affairs, but the sweet, heartfelt infatuations of a sheltered girl. She would collect photographs of handsome young officers and marry a different one each day. Once, she developed such a strong crush on an officer that she learned his full name and would playfully sign letters and drawings as Mrs. So-and-so. It was charming, naive, and a little bit sad. It was a fantasy of connection, a way for her to imagine a life where she could choose her own love, a freedom she would never have. As she grew from a cherubic child into a striking young woman, her beauty became legendary. With her mother's height, her father's gentle expression, and her famous saucer eyes, she was widely considered the prettiest of the sisters. But it was a beauty that was radiant rather than intimidating. It emanated from her inner warmth. A courtier once described her as a classic Russian beauty, a modern version of the beauties of the painter Boyar. Another said she was like a Botticelli angel, yet she seemed completely unaware of her own looks. There was no vanity in her. There was, however, a growing physical strength. She was surprisingly powerful, able to lift her tutors off the ground in a playful hug, and sometimes underestimating her own strength, accidentally breaking a piece of furniture or a toy. This physical robustness was a constant ironic counterpoint to the heartbreaking fragility of her beloved younger brother, Alexei. She doted on him, and her strength was a shield for his weakness. She was the one who could carry him when he was too weak to walk, her strong arms a safe harbor during his bouts of illness. In 1913, the Romanov dynasty celebrated its tercentenary, 300 years of rule. The family embarked on a grand tour across the heart of Russia, and the nation erupted in a wave of patriotic fervor. For 14-year-old Maria, it must have been a dazzling, overwhelming experience. She, who had lived such a sheltered life, was now at the center of a massive empire-wide celebration. Dressed in beautiful white court gowns, she and her sisters were greeted by massive, adoring crowds who saw them as semi-divine figures, the beautiful daughters of their God-appointed ruler. This journey was the high-water mark of the Romanovs' popularity in the 20th century. It was a fleeting, deceptive moment of unity and adoration. For Maria, it was a glimpse of the public life she was born to lead, a life of ceremony and symbolism. But as she smiled and waved to the cheering masses, did she feel a connection? Or did she, even then, dream of a quieter life, far from the crowds and the weight of the crown? We can only guess. But we know that this brilliant flash of glory was the last of its kind. A storm was gathering on the horizon, a storm that would not only sweep away the tercentenary's hollow promises, but would also engulf Maria and her entire family in a tide of unimaginable violence. The world was about to change forever, and the peaceful, ordered life of the good Mashka was about to be shattered. The summer of 1914. For most of Europe, it was the last summer of an old world, a final sun-drenched moment of peace before the continent plunged into the abyss. For the Romanov family, this was truer than for anyone. Their time was spent, as it often was, aboard their magnificent imperial yacht, the Standard. This sleek, black-hulled vessel was more than a ship. It was a floating sanctuary, the one place where they could escape the crushing formality of the court and simply be a family. Here Nicholas was not the Tsar of all the Russias, but just Papa, and Alexandra was not the Empress, but Mama, and Maria, who had just turned 15, was in her element. Freed from her lessons, she could indulge in her love for the outdoors. We see her in photographs from that summer, no longer a child, but not yet a woman, her face tanned by the sun, her famous blue eyes sparkling with laughter. She played tennis on the deck with her father, swam in the cold Baltic waters with her sisters, and took part in the boisterous games that Anastasia always seemed to be inventing. It was also a time of innocent flirtations. The young naval officers on the yacht were the closest thing to male companions the Grand Duchesses ever had. They were a captive audience for the girls' charms, and a game of one-upmanship often ensued. Maria, with her warm, open nature and burgeoning beauty, was a particular favorite. She would chat and laugh with the officers, her shyness momentarily forgotten in the relaxed holiday atmosphere. Her diary from this time is filled with the small, happy details of a teenage girl's life. Played bezique with Papa, bathed, went for a walk. There is no hint of the darkness to come. These were the golden days, a final fleeting chapter of innocence, preserved forever in the sepia tones of their family albums. They were sailing blissfully unaware towards the single event that would trigger the world's first global war, the assassination of an archduke in a faraway city called Sarajevo. The news of war shattered the peace of that summer. Germany declared war on Russia, and the world was irrevocably changed. A tidal wave of patriotism, a feeling not seen since the tercentenary, swept across the Russian Empire. In St. Petersburg, crowds fell to their knees and sang, "God save the Tsar," as Nicholas appeared on the balcony of the Winter Palace. The city's name was quickly changed to the more Slavic-sounding Petrograd in a burst of anti-German sentiment. The Romanovs, like their people, were caught up in this initial wave of patriotic duty. The Standard was put into dry dock, the palaces were turned into command centers, and the family's life was completely reoriented toward the war effort. For Empress Alexandra and her two eldest daughters, Olga and Tatiana, this meant undertaking a task of staggering commitment. They enrolled as student nurses in a professional Red Cross course under the formidable Dr. Vera Gidroitz, one of Russia's first female surgeons. This was no ceremonial gesture. They learned anatomy, disinfection, and how to dress horrific wounds. After earning their certificates, they worked for hours every day in the operating theater and wards of the hospital they established at Tsarskoye Selo. The Empress and the Grand Duchesses, who had lived their lives shielded from all unpleasantness, now stood for hours on end, assisting in amputations, handling severed limbs, and comforting men dying in agony. It was a brutal, bloody, and emotionally shattering education in the reality of war. Maria and Anastasia, at 15 and 13, were deemed too young for such grueling work. They were consumed with envy for their older sisters and desperate to contribute. "We too are now, alas, out of work," a frustrated Maria wrote in her diary, "as we are too young." But their mother soon found a role for them. They became the patrons of their own small hospital, a 65-bed infirmary, set up in a building adjacent to their main one. Here, they would care for wounded officers. While they were spared the horrors of the operating theater, their work was far from trivial. They became the heart and soul of this small hospital. Every morning, after their shortened lessons, the little pair, as they were affectionately known, would arrive at their hospital dressed in the simple gray and white uniform of a nursing sister. Maria, in particular, found her true calling here. All the qualities that had defined her childhood, her warmth, her empathy, her interest in people, and her simple kindness, were now channeled into her work. She wasn't a skilled surgical nurse like Tatiana, but she had a different, equally valuable gift. She was a profound source of comfort. She would spend hours with the soldiers. She'd sit by their bedsides, her needlework in her lap, and simply talk to them, asking about their homes, their wives, their children. For men who were broken, traumatized, and 1,000 miles from home, the presence of this gentle, beautiful Grand Duchess, who treated them not as subjects but as friends, was a powerful tonic. She read them stories, wrote letters home for those who couldn't, and played endless games of checkers and cards. Anna Verubova, their mother's closest friend, recalled, "Maria was an angel of patience, sitting for hours by the cots of the wounded men. She had none of her mother's or Olga's shyness. She was completely natural and at ease, her laughter often echoing through the quiet wards. This was the first time in her life that she had been allowed to have extended meaningful contact with people from outside the imperial bubble, and she blossomed. The soldiers, in turn, adored her. They saw past the title and saw the girl, the good Mashka. Naturally, for a girl of Maria's age and romantic temperament, these close interactions with handsome, heroic young officers sometimes blossomed into innocent infatuations. The hospital wards became the backdrop for a series of teenage crushes. She kept a photo album filled with pictures of her favorite patients, and her diary entries are sprinkled with their names. This wasn't scandalous. It was the completely normal reaction of a young girl in a highly abnormal situation. It was a way of processing the intensity of her new life, a flicker of youthful romance amidst the grim reality of war. One officer, in particular, seems to have captured her heart. His name was Dmitry Malama, a dashing officer of the Imperial Guard. While recovering from an injury at their hospital in 1914, he charmed the entire family with his good looks and impeccable manners. He gave Tatiana a French bulldog, which she named Ortino, and seems to have paid special attention to Maria. The Tsarina herself mentioned it in a letter to Nicholas. "My little Malama came in for a little while this afternoon. He is a charming boy. I must say he would make an excellent son-in-law. Why are foreign princes not like him? Even the Tsar was fond of him, and there were quiet jokes within the family about a potential match. For Maria, it was likely the most serious crush of her life. After Malama returned to the front, she would ask after him constantly. When another officer told her that he had seen Malama, Maria reportedly flushed to the roots of her hair and bombarded the man with questions. It was a sweet, poignant what-if, a glimpse of a future she might have had in a different world. But the hospital was not a place of romance. It was a place of pain. And for a girl as empathetic as Maria, the suffering she witnessed took a heavy toll. She saw young men, boys not much older than herself, with shattered limbs and disfigured faces. She held their hands as they succumbed to their wounds. She saw, day after day, the horrific human cost of the conflict her father was leading. This experience stripped away her naivete. The cheerful girl who loved parties and dreamed of soldiers was now face to face with the brutal reality of what being a soldier meant. The war work matured her, deepened her compassion, and undoubtedly left scars on her gentle soul. While Maria and her family dedicated themselves to the war effort, the very foundations of their world were crumbling. The initial wave of patriotism soon soured as the war dragged on. Russia suffered catastrophic losses at the front. At home, there were food shortages, economic collapse, and a growing sense of anger and despair. And at the center of this growing storm of public hatred was Maria's mother, the Empress Alexandra. Her German birth was now seen as proof of treason. Wild, vicious rumors, fanned by political enemies and a hostile press, spread like wildfire. It was whispered that she was a German spy, that she had a secret telegraph wire to the Kaiser hidden in her bedroom, that she was deliberately sabotaging the Russian war effort, and inextricably linked with these accusations was the sinister figure of Grigory Rasputin. With Nicholas away at army headquarters for long periods, Alexandra was left as the de facto regent in Petrograd, and she relied heavily on Rasputin's advice. Ministers were hired and fired on his recommendation. His debauched private life was legendary, and his influence over the empress was seen as proof that the entire regime was corrupt, decadent, and rotten to the core. For Maria and her sisters, this was a source of profound confusion and pain. They had known Rasputin since childhood. To them, he was our friend, a holy man whose prayers miraculously eased their brother's suffering. They couldn't reconcile this image with the demonic figure described in the newspapers and whispered about by society. They saw their mother, whom they adored, being vilified as a traitor and a harlot, and they were powerless to defend her. The hatred that now surrounded their family was a suffocating poison. In December 1916, the inevitable happened. A group of aristocrats, led by the Tsar's own cousin by marriage, Prince Felix Yusupov, brutally murdered Rasputin in a desperate attempt to save the monarchy from his influence. The family was devastated. Alexandra sank into a deep depression, convinced that with Rasputin's death, their last protector was gone. For Maria and her sisters, it was a terrifying event. The murder wasn't just a political act, it was a violent intrusion into their small private world. It signaled that the rules of society had broken down, that even the highest in the land were no longer safe. The winter that followed was one of the coldest in memory. In Petrograd, the situation was desperate. The city was starving. Long bread lines snaked through the frozen streets, and the mood was turning ugly. Riots broke out. The Tsar, isolated at military headquarters, received reassuring reports from his ministers and failed to grasp the sheer scale of the crisis. The end was coming, but inside the Alexander Palace, the family was facing a more immediate, personal crisis. In February 1917, as the revolution was about to ignite, a measles epidemic swept through the palace. One by one, the imperial children fell ill. First Olga and Alexei, then Tatiana. Finally, Maria and Anastasia succumbed. Their cases were severe, complicated by pneumonia. For days, they lay in darkened rooms, burning with fever, their lungs struggling for air. Maria, the picture of robust health, was now terrifyingly frail. Her thick brown hair, matted from the fever and medication, had to be shaved off. The 5 children of the Tsar and Tsarina, at the very moment their father's empire was collapsing, were fighting for their own lives, completely oblivious to the historical cataclysm unfolding just beyond their palace gates. By early March, the chaos in Petrograd had become a full-blown revolution. The Tsar, attempting to return to his family, had his train diverted by revolutionary troops. Alone, exhausted, and abandoned by his generals, on March 15, 1917, Nicholas II signed the instrument of abdication. In a single stroke of a pen, 304 years of Romanov rule came to an end. He was no longer an emperor. He was simply Colonel Nicholas Romanov. Back at the Alexander Palace, the children were slowly beginning to recover. They were still weak, their shorn heads a stark symbol of their vulnerability when their mother had to break the news. Their father was coming home, but he was no longer the Tsar. They were now prisoners. The familiar, friendly faces of the Imperial Guard disappeared, replaced by armed revolutionary soldiers with red armbands. Red flags, the symbol of the revolution, now flew over their home. Imagine the shock, the utter disorientation. For Maria, whose entire worldview was built on a foundation of love for her father and faith in his God-given authority, this must have been incomprehensible. The world as she knew it had ceased to exist. Their gilded cage had become a literal prison. They were confined to a small section of the palace grounds. Their mail was read, their phone calls monitored. The life of routine and order was gone, replaced by a terrifying uncertainty. Yet even in these first frightening days of captivity, Maria's essential nature shone through. Just as she had done in the hospitals, she instinctively tried to build bridges. She would approach the new guards, many of whom were hostile and ideologically opposed to everything she represented, and speak to them. She'd ask their names, inquire about their families, and try to engage them in simple human conversation. This wasn't a calculated strategy for survival. It was just who she was. She saw the person, not the uniform or the politics. Some of the guards were disarmed by her guileless sincerity and responded with kindness. Others remained suspicious, seeing her friendliness as the condescending charm of the oppressor. This complex dynamic, this dance between human connection and political hatred, would define the long, painful months of their imprisonment that were to come. The family was now entirely at the mercy of their captors, and their journey into the heart of the Russian darkness had just begun. The spring and summer of 1917 were a strange, surreal limbo for the Romanov family. Imprisoned within the familiar walls of the Alexander Palace, the world they had known was gone, yet the physical surroundings remained the same. It was a life of jarring contradictions. They were surrounded by priceless art and furniture, yet their food was rationed. They were guarded by soldiers who, just months before, would have been executed for showing them a fraction of the disrespect they now displayed daily. Their new life was a monotonous routine, a deliberate attempt to impose order on a world that had descended into chaos. Their days were marked by a rigid schedule, a final remnant of their imperial lives. Lessons for the younger children continued under the guidance of their tutors, who had bravely chosen to remain with them. Meals were simple and served at precise times. In the evenings, their father, now just Nicholas Romanov, would read aloud to them from the classics, Tolstoy, Turgenev, or Dickens. It was an attempt to maintain a facade of civilized normalcy, while the world outside the park railings spiraled into anarchy. Each of them coped with the psychological strain differently. The Empress Alexandra retreated deeper into her mystical faith, spending hours in prayer. Olga, the most introspective, fell into a deep depression, becoming listless and irritable. Tatiana, ever the stoic governess, took charge of organizing their domestic life, her composure a source of strength for everyone. Anastasia, true to form, tried to fight the gloom with pranks and jokes, though her humor now had a frantic, brittle edge. And Maria? Her sunny, uncomplicated nature was perhaps her greatest asset during this time. Less prone to the dark brooding of her eldest sister, she found solace in the simple and the physical. Her diary from this period focuses not on political events, but on the small, tangible details of her day, the weather, the books she read, the games she played. She threw herself into any physical activity available. To the astonishment of their guards, the children of the former Tsar began to transform the manicured lawns of the palace into a large vegetable garden. They saw it as their contribution, a way to supplement their rations, and more importantly, a way to combat the crushing boredom. Maria, with her remarkable physical strength, was a tireless worker. She dug, she planted, she hauled water for hours under the summer sun. For a young woman who had been raised to be an ornamental figurehead, this hard, dirty, manual labor was a strange kind of liberation. It was real, it was productive, and it left her too tired at the end of the day to dwell on their terrifying predicament. One can imagine that for Maria, who had always dreamed of a simple life in the country, this act of cultivating the earth held a special poignant significance. She was, in a way, living a fractured piece of her dream, even as it took place inside a prison. The most complex and dangerous part of their new reality was their relationship with their captors. The soldiers who guarded them were a constantly changing cast of characters, a cross-section of revolutionary Russia. Some were cruel ideologues who took every opportunity to humiliate the family. They would scrawl obscene drawings on the walls, whistle, and make lewd comments as the Grand Duchesses walked by, and deliberately blow cigarette smoke in their faces. But others were simply ordinary men, peasants and workers, who over time found their revolutionary hatred challenged by the family's quiet dignity. They had been told the Romanovs were blood-drinking monsters, and instead they found a polite, deeply religious family who spoke to them with kindness. In this delicate dance of human interaction, Maria was the family's unintentional diplomat. Her open, trusting nature, her complete lack of arrogance, often broke through the guards' political conditioning. She would smile at them, ask them about their villages, and genuinely listen to their answers. This friendliness, however, was a double-edged sword. Alexander Kerensky, the head of the provisional government, paid a visit to the palace and was alarmed by the easy familiarity he witnessed between the young Grand Duchesses and their guards. In his memoirs, he specifically noted that Maria was forming a particularly close and, in his view, dangerous attachment to one of the soldiers. He wrote of an incident where he caught a young guard gazing at Maria during a religious service with the eyes of a lovesick youth. Fearing a plot or a scandal, Kerensky had the entire guard detachment replaced with more disciplined soldiers. This incident is often sensationalized, but the truth is likely far more poignant. The Grand Duchesses were young women, starved of any normal social contact. The guards were young men. Innocent conversations and harmless flirtations were almost inevitable. For Maria, whose heart was always open, it was simply natural to be friendly. She didn't possess the cynical caution that her circumstances now demanded. Her greatest strength, her guileless, loving heart, was also her greatest vulnerability. She simply didn't know how to see an enemy in the person standing in front of her. As the summer of 1917 wore on, the political situation in Petrograd became increasingly volatile. Kerensky's government was losing control. The Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Lenin, were gaining power, and their calls for death to the tyrants grew louder. Kerensky became convinced that he could no longer guarantee the family's safety in the capital. He feared a mob could storm the palace and lynch them all. A plan was hatched to move them somewhere remote, deep in the Russian interior. The initial hope had been to send them to England to seek refuge with their cousin, King George V. But the British government, fearing a socialist backlash at home, got cold feet, and the king tragically withdrew his offer of asylum. The family was trapped in Russia. The destination chosen was a remote town in the wilds of Siberia, Tobolsk. The departure was shrouded in secrecy. In the dead of night on August 13th, the family was woken and told to prepare to leave. They had no idea where they were going. With only a few hours to pack a lifetime of memories, they gathered their personal belongings, their favorite icons, and their beloved pets. In the pre-dawn gloom, they walked out of the Alexander Palace for the last time. As she passed through the gates, Maria, like her family, must have been filled with a terrible sense of dread and finality. This had been the only real home she had ever known, and she would never see it again. They were transported under heavy guard to a nearby station and bundled onto a train marked with a Japanese Red Cross mission to mislead any observers. For 6 long days they traveled east, their train winding its way through the immense, unforgiving landscape of Russia. Through the guarded windows, Maria would have seen the endless birch forests and vast plains of the country she was once a princess of. It was now a foreign land, and she was an exile crossing it. They eventually left the train and boarded a river steamer, the Rus, for the final leg of their journey. Finally, on August 19th, they arrived in Tobolsk. It was a quiet, muddy provincial town, a place of political exile for centuries. It was a world away from the imperial splendor of Petrograd. Their new home was the former governor's mansion, a large but decaying white stucco building they ironically nicknamed Freedom House. For a time, life here was an improvement over their final tense months at the palace. The guards were from an older, more disciplined unit and treated them with a degree of respect. The townspeople were largely indifferent, though some would bow or cross themselves when the family was spotted through the windows. It seemed for a brief moment that they might be able to wait out the storm in relative peace. They fell back into a familiar routine. Nicholas taught the children history and geography. The Empress gave them lessons in religion. To combat the soul-crushing boredom, they put on amateur theatricals. The whole family would participate, learning lines and creating makeshift costumes. Maria, who had never been an academic, shone in these performances. She loved the drama, the emotion, the chance to be someone else for a few hours. Eyewitnesses recalled her acting with great enthusiasm and humor, her infectious laughter bringing a rare moment of light to their gloomy existence. When the Siberian winter arrived, they built a large snow mountain in the courtyard, spending hours sliding down it on sleds, their laughter echoing in the frozen air. It was a desperate, courageous attempt to create a pocket of normalcy, to pretend they were just a family on a strange extended holiday. But they were not on holiday. They were prisoners, and their fate was being decided 1,000 miles away. In late October, a telegraph brought the news that would seal their doom. Kerensky's government had been overthrown. The Bolsheviks were in power. The atmosphere in Freedom House changed overnight. The family understood the significance of this news immediately. They were now in the hands of men who had built their entire political ideology on the destruction of the monarchy. They were no longer political prisoners to be protected. They were class enemies to be eliminated. The old, more lenient guards were soon replaced by a new detachment of hard-line Bolsheviks, raw recruits from the factories of the Urals, filled with revolutionary zeal and class hatred. The humiliations began almost at once. Their comfortable existence was systematically dismantled. They were put on meager soldiers' rations. Butter and coffee became distant memories. The girls had to learn to do their own laundry and mending. Nicholas was forbidden from wearing his colonel's epaulets, a small but deeply symbolic act designed to strip him of his last vestiges of military identity. The soldiers' behavior became coarse and menacing. They would follow the girls to the lavatory, scrawl lewd graffiti on the fences, and refer to the former Tsar as Nicholas the Blood Drinker. The snow mountain they had built with so much effort was contemptuously destroyed. In the face of this escalating cruelty, Maria's strength was tested as never before. She, who thrived on kindness and warmth, was now surrounded by open hostility. Yet, according to the diaries of those with them, she met this new reality not with despair, but with a quiet, practical resilience. She took on more than her share of the household chores, her physical strength once again proving to be an invaluable asset. There's a powerful and telling image recorded by one of their attendants, Maria, the Grand Duchess, in the frozen courtyard, sawing logs for firewood alongside the male servants, her cheeks flushed with effort, refusing to be broken by the hardship. She tried to remain cheerful, especially for her frail brother and her despairing mother, but even her sunny disposition had its limits. One of the tutors, Sidney Gibbous, noted in his diary a rare moment of vulnerability. When a soldier brusquely snatched a gold watch from Alexei, Maria, witnessing the casual cruelty, burst into tears of helpless rage and frustration. It was a crack in the brave facade, a sign that the relentless psychological pressure was taking its toll on them all. The relative peace of Tobolsk had become a new, more brutal kind of prison, and their final terrible journey was about to begin. The arrival of the Bolsheviks in Tobolsk marked the end of the Romanovs' last semblance of peace. The winter of 1918 was a season of escalating cruelty and dread. Then in April, a man arrived from Moscow who would irrevocably alter their fate. His name was Vasily Yakovlev, a special commissar sent with orders to remove Nicholas from Tobolsk. The official reason was to take him to Moscow to stand trial. Nicholas, ever the fatalist, prepared to go alone. But Alexandra, terrified of being separated from her husband, insisted she accompany him. This created an agonizing problem. Their son, Alexei, had recently suffered a severe hemorrhage after a fall and was completely bedridden, unable to be moved. A terrible decision had to be made. Which of the daughters would go with them, and which would stay behind to care for the desperately ill Tsarevich? Alexandra chose Maria. Why Maria? In her letters, the Empress explained her reasoning. Olga was too emotionally fragile, still suffering from bouts of depression. Tatiana was needed to manage the household and look after Alexei. Anastasia was too young. It was Maria, the strong one, the cheerful one, the good Mashka, who was deemed best suited to endure the hardships of the journey and provide emotional support for her parents. It was a testament to Maria's character, to her perceived resilience. It was also, unknowingly, a death sentence. The farewell was heartbreaking. The family was being torn apart, with no guarantee they would ever see each other again. Olga, Tatiana, and Anastasia wept as they clung to their parents and sister. From his bed, a pale Alexei begged his father not to leave. Maria, trying to be brave for everyone, promised her sister she would look after their parents. As she stepped into the crude peasant cart that would begin their journey, the 18-year-old Grand Duchess was now the designated protector of the former Emperor and Empress of Russia. The journey was an ordeal. They traveled for days in rough, springless carts called tarantasses, jolting over roads that were little more than rivers of mud and melting snow. They slept on the floors of squalid post houses, surrounded by rough, intimidating red guards. Yet through it all, Maria's strength did not fail her. She helped her mother, who was in agony from her chronic sciatica, and tried to keep her father's spirits up. The commissar, Yakovlev, treated them with a surprising degree of courtesy, which gave them a sliver of false hope. They believed they were truly heading to Moscow, but the journey took a sudden, ominous turn. Yakovlev received new orders. Radical Bolsheviks in the Ural region, fearing a rescue attempt, were demanding the prisoners be brought to them. The train was diverted. Their new destination was not Moscow, but the red capital of the Urals, a city seething with revolutionary hatred, Ekaterinburg. On April 30th, 1918, they arrived. As they were driven through the city, they were met with jeering crowds. Their final prison was a large, requisitioned merchant's house in the center of town. High wooden fences had been erected around it, blocking out the world. The windows had been painted over. On the door was a sign. It was the house of a man named Ipatiev, but it would go down in history by its official Bolshevik designation, the House of Special Purpose. The moment Maria stepped across the threshold, she knew this was not a place of detention. This was a tomb. The regime inside was one of calculated cruelty. The guards, factory workers from the local Zlokazov and Verk-Isetsk plants were commanded by Alexander Avdeyev, a drunkard who took sadistic pleasure in tormenting his prisoners. Their belongings were searched and items were frequently stolen. The family was confined to a few upstairs rooms under constant 24-hour surveillance. Even their trips to the lavatory were monitored by guards who scrawled obscene drawings of the Empress and Rasputin on the walls. Maria, alongside her parents and the few loyal servants who had accompanied them, endured these first weeks with quiet fortitude. She helped her mother make the beds, mended their clothes, and tried her best to ignore the guards' taunts. But the worst part was the separation from her siblings. "Oh, how dreadfully lonely it is without you," she wrote in a smuggled letter. "I've grown thin, but I'm cheerful as always." That line, cheerful as always, speaks volumes. It was her duty, her role, her shield. In late May, the remaining children finally arrived from Tobolsk. Their reunion was a moment of intense, bittersweet joy, a brief respite from the gloom. The family was whole again, but the joy was short-lived as Olga, Tatiana, Anastasia, and the frail Alexei were immediately subjected to the same brutal reality. The guards were particularly lewd towards the young women. Yet even in this pit of hatred, Maria's instinct for kindness flickered. There's a story, recorded in the memoirs of one of the guards, that is almost unbearably poignant. On June 23rd, one of the guards, Ivan Skorokodov, was celebrating his birthday. Maria and her sisters, hearing of this, decided to do something. From their own meager rations, they baked him a small loaf of bread, and Maria presented it to him with a flower. It was a simple human gesture, an attempt to find a glimmer of decency in the darkness. But in the Ipatiev house, such gestures were dangerous. When the commandant found out, he was furious. Skorokodov and several other guards who had begun to show signs of sympathy were immediately dismissed from their posts, replaced by even more hardened and fanatical men. Maria's act of kindness had, paradoxically, sealed their fate, ensuring they would be surrounded only by their most ruthless enemies in their final days. In early July, there was another change. Avdeyev was replaced by a new commandant. His name was Yakov Yurovsky. He was a senior Cheka operative, the Bolshevik secret police. Unlike the drunken Avdeyev, Yurovsky was cold, methodical, and efficient. The regime became even stricter. Bars were placed on the windows. The prisoners felt a palpable shift. The end was near. In their final days, they read the Bible together, finding solace in the story of Job, the righteous man who suffered for no reason. They knew they were going to die. On the night of July 16th, the family went to bed as usual. Just after midnight, they were awoken by Yurovsky. He told them there was unrest in the town, and for their own safety, they needed to be moved to the basement. Calmly, without panic, they dressed. Nicholas carried his son, who couldn't walk. Alexandra followed. Then the 4 daughters, their doctor, and 3 loyal servants. Maria and her sisters carried pillows, and Anastasia brought her little dog, Jimmy. They descended the stairs to a small, empty room in the cellar. 2 chairs were brought for Alexandra and Alexei. The others stood, waiting. Yurovsky entered with his execution squad. He pulled out a piece of paper and read a formal declaration. The Ural Soviet had sentenced them to death. Nicholas, bewildered, turned to his family and managed to utter, "What? What?" before Yurovsky raised a pistol and shot him in the chest. That was the signal. The room exploded in a chaotic hail of gunfire. It was a small space, and the assassins, choking on smoke and plaster dust, fired wildly. The Tsar and Tsarina died almost instantly, but the nightmare was not over. When the smoke cleared, the executioners saw something that horrified them. Several of the daughters were still alive. Unbeknownst to their captors, the girls had sewn their personal jewels and diamonds into the linings of their corsets, hoping to keep them safe. These makeshift vests had acted as a bizarre, ineffective form of body armor, deflecting many of the bullets. What followed was a scene of pure butchery. The drunken executioner Peter Ermakov, enraged, began stabbing at the wounded with a bayonet. According to the accounts of the killers themselves, Maria was one of the last to die. Wounded and terrified, she and Anastasia were huddled against the back wall, screaming, until the killers set upon them with bayonets and point-blank shots to the head. Grand Duchess Maria Nikolaevna, the gentle soul, the picture of health and kindness, was brutally murdered. She was 19 years old. The crime was as gruesome as the cover-up was frantic. The 11 bodies were loaded onto a truck and driven to a disused mine shaft in a forest called Ganina Yama. There, the killers stripped and burned the bodies with petrol and sulfuric acid in a desperate, 2-day-long attempt to destroy them beyond recognition. Finally, they dumped what was left into the flooded mine shaft. But fearing the location wasn't secure, Yurovsky's men returned, retrieved the mangled remains, and took them to a different spot. They buried 9 of the bodies in a shallow pit, hidden beneath a cart track on a rough road near a place called Porosenkov Log, or Pig's Meadow. The remains of 2 of the children, Alexei and one of his sisters, were burned separately nearby and buried in a second, smaller pit. Their terrible secret, they thought, was safe. For decades, the Soviet Union maintained a wall of silence. They announced only the Tsar's death, leaving the fate of his family a mystery. This silence gave birth to a powerful myth, the myth of the survivor. Dozens of women came forward claiming to be Anastasia, the most famous being Anna Anderson. These stories captured the world's imagination, a desperate hope that someone, at least, had escaped the horror of that basement. Then in 1991, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, the truth began to emerge. The 9 bodies from the main grave were exhumed. Groundbreaking DNA science using a blood sample from Britain's Prince Philip, a maternal relative, confirmed the identities. It was the Tsar, the Tsarina, and 3 of their daughters, Olga, Tatiana, and Anastasia. The famous survivor had died with her family. 2 bodies were still missing, Alexei and 1 Grand Duchess. For years, a fierce debate raged. Russian experts, based on initial analysis, insisted the missing daughter was Maria. But many American scientists disagreed. They argued that the skeleton identified as Anastasia was too short to be her, and that it was in fact Maria who was missing. The quiet daughter overlooked in life was now at the center of a final confounding mystery. The mystery remained unsolved until the summer of 2007. A group of amateur Russian archaeologists, guided by the notes of the original executioners, were searching the area around the main grave, and there, in a small scorched patch of earth, they found them, 44 small shattered and burned bone fragments. It was the second grave. An exhaustive international investigation began. The world's top DNA laboratories put the fragments to the test, and in 2009 the results were announced, and they were conclusive. The fragments belonged to two individuals, a boy and a girl, both maternally related to the Empress Alexandra and paternally related to the Tsar Nicholas. They were Alexei and his sister. The final mystery of the Romanovs was over. The last of the lost children to be found, the one whose remains had lain hidden for 90 years, was Grand Duchess Maria. So, who was Maria Nikolaevna? She was not a political strategist, a celebrated intellectual, or a revolutionary icon. Her story is quieter, more personal, and perhaps for that reason, more profound. She was a young woman of profound kindness and simple desires, born into a world of unimaginable complexity and privilege. She dreamed of a life that most of us would consider ordinary, a home, a husband she loved, and children to care for. Her defining characteristics were her strength, her warmth, and a guileless, trusting heart that saw the humanity in everyone, even her enemies. In the end, it was this very goodness that made her story so tragic. Her life serves as a devastating reminder that in times of ideological hatred, it is often the innocent, the gentle, and the compassionate who suffer the most. Maria's story forces us to look beyond the grand sweep of history, beyond the politics and the revolutions, and to see the individual human souls caught in the storm. She is the face of the countless, voiceless victims of fanaticism. She was not a saint, but a sweet, flawed, loving young woman who deserved a life she never got to live. Grand Duchess Maria, the good Mashka, the lost angel of the Romanovs, was finally found. And in finding her, we are reminded of a simple, eternal truth, that a gentle heart is the most precious and sometimes the most fragile thing in the world.